She created a scent that made a mafia boss fall in love with her, but she couldn't escape him. After all, he was captivated by these pheromones. After that day, everything changed. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. Enjoy watching. Lee Hansel wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a living legend in Seoul's criminal underworld. His name was whispered with a mixture of fear and respect. He built his empire from scratch, starting with small-time scams and gradually seizing control of the port, nightclubs, and construction businesses. His organization, known as the Shadows, was a perfectly tuned machine, where every cog knew its place. Hansel himself controlled everything with an iron fist. He was 38 years old, but his gaze was that of an old man, tired and piercing, seeing right through you. Everyone feared him, from street vendors to high-ranking officials. He never raised his voice or waved his arms. His strength lay in his silence, in the way he could stare at a person without blinking until they began to sweat and stutter. He demanded absolute, blind loyalty from his men. Betrayal was more than just a misdemeanor. It was a violation of everything he believed in. In his world, where word and honor meant more than any contract, trust was currency and loyalty a shield. One day, against his usual habit, he confided in a man named Kang Do-hyun. Young, ambitious, with a brilliant mind and a Western education, Do-hyun seemed like the perfect acquisition. He was charismatic and knew how to find common ground with anyone, from Russian mafiosi to the Yakuza. Hansel, usually distrustful of upstarts, saw him not only as an enforcer, but also as a potential successor. He took him under his wing, teaching him the intricacies of business, which weren't covered in any economics textbook. He even allowed Do-hyun to address him by his first name instead of boss, an unheard-of privilege. Do-hyun seemed devoted, body and soul. He accompanied Hansel to key meetings, offered ingenious solutions to complex problems, and always put the organization's interests first. 2 years passed. Hansel, whose suspicions were legendary, began to trust him. And that was his fatal mistake. The time had come for one of the largest operations in the history of the Shadows. It involved transferring a huge sum of money, $20 million, through shell offshore companies to purchase a shipment of weapons. The money had to undergo a complex journey through several countries to be laundered. Hansel, without hesitation, entrusted this operation to Do-hyun. He gave him authority, access to accounts carte blanche. He saw the glint in the young man's eyes and mistook it for zeal. But Do-hyun had deceived him. He hadn't simply stolen the money. He had planned it all down to the last detail. Over the course of a week, he had transferred the funds through a chain of 12 different accounts, and then vanished into thin air. Vanished without a trace, as if he had never existed. Gone were his phone, his belongings from the apartment the organization had paid for. He left behind only a digital echo, and the bitter taste of betrayal. For Hansel, this wasn't just theft. 20 million was a significant sum, but not fatal to his empire. No, it was something more. It was an insult, a slap in the face, a personal grievance that burned within him. He, whom no one had ever dared deceive, was being made a fool. He had believed, opened up, and been used. The thought drove him crazy. His philosophy of retribution was simple and merciless. Anyone who dared betray him ultimately came to bitterly regret it. Hansel found them wherever they hid. He was a patient hunter. First, he took back every penny, often with enormous interest. He bankrupted his offenders, leaving them with nothing, but he didn't stop there. Then came the brutal punishment. It wasn't always physical. A broken will, a ruined reputation, and public humiliation were often more terrible than a simple bullet. And most importantly, their loved ones suffered too. Wives, children, parents, lovers. Hansel believed that a traitor, by putting his life on the line, automatically puts the lives of those he loves on the line. This was the silent but iron law of his world. A lesson that everyone saw and which discouraged anyone from repeating Do-hyun's mistake. He did this not out of sadism, but out of cold, calculating pragmatism. Fear was a tool, and demonstrative retribution was the best means of maintaining it. In Do-hyun's case, Hansel's fury was unprecedented. He ordered his men to find him, no matter the cost. Every resource was deployed. Hackers, paid informants, corrupt police officers, even fortune tellers, anyone who could help. But Do-hyun proved smarter and more cunning than anyone could have imagined. It was as if he had vanished. There were no traces, no transactions, no calls. He hid well, like a professional spy who had studied all the methods of his pursuers. 3 weeks passed. Tension within the shadows was growing. Hansel was as dark as a thundercloud, his anger hanging in the air, poisoning everything around him. And then, in his office, looking out at the empty street beyond the tinted glass, he made a decision. If he couldn't find Do-hyun himself, he had to find his weak spot. Everyone has one. Love, affection, something he couldn't abandon. He ordered a thorough investigation into Do-hyun's life. Dig deep, question everyone he'd ever come into contact with. And 2 days later, the answer arrived. Amidst tons of useless information, one detail emerged. Do-hyun had a sister, a completely innocent one, unrelated to his affairs. They had been very close as children, and even though their paths had diverged, he still secretly supported her financially. He carefully concealed her existence, but an old neighbor, remembering the girl, put him on the trail. Her name was Amara. Amara woke to the sound of rain. She smiled. This rain was perfect for her new fragrance, quiet dawn after rain. Today, she had a meeting with the boutique owner. It was a chance to promote her creation. Her life was moving toward its goal. The dream of owning her own perfume shop seemed ever closer. She imagined a cozy space scented only with beauty. It would be a complete counterbalance to her brother's world. Kang Do-hyun, her brother, lived in another world. Their last meeting 6 months ago revealed the gulf between them. He invited her to an expensive cafe. He talked about deals and partners. His eyes darted around. He placed a thick convergence of money on the table. "Take it. Buy yourself something," he said. Amara gently pushed the converge aside. "Thank you, but I can handle this myself. I have clients." Do-hyun snorted. "So what? Are you going to live on these pennies for the rest of your life? I can give you everything." "I don't want everything," she answered quietly. "I want what's mine, what I made with my own hands." He looked at her with irritation. He didn't understand her choice. From then on, she avoided meeting him. Their rare calls were brief and tense. She didn't want to know about his affairs. His world was full of lies and danger. Her world was here, the small laboratory in her apartment. It was her sanctuary. Rows of bottles of oil stood on the table, each one neatly labeled. Everything lay in perfect order. The place smelled of jasmine, damp oak, bergamot, and musk. For her, it was the language she used to communicate with the world. She couldn't live a day without creating. Even without commissions, she experimented. She mixed incense and vanilla for a cozy atmosphere. She added sea salt to citrus for freshness. It was her breath. Before the meeting, she carefully packed her professional bag. She checked each bottle. Jasmine for tenderness, oak for strength, bergamot for clarity, musk for mystery. Everything was securely fastened. Today's meeting was an opportunity. A step toward a dream. She closed her eyes and imagined her store. Light wood shelves, crystal bottles, warm light, people coming inside in search of their scent. She'd find them the perfect match, see the smiles and gratitude in their eyes. The thought warmed her. This was her path, pure and honest. She walked out of the house, clutching a bag of precious oils. The rain had almost stopped. The air was fresh and moist, just like her new scent. She walked with confidence. Today was going to be a success. Her thoughts were preoccupied with the upcoming presentation. She mentally rehearsed the words she would say to the boutique owner. Suddenly, quite unexpectedly, she was overcome by a strange, almost physical sensation. A slight but persistent anxiety. At first, it was just a vague unease, as if a quiet but unpleasant ringing had begun somewhere in the back of her mind. Then the anxiety began to grow, turning into full-blown panic. Her heart began to beat faster, her palms became clammy, and goosebumps ran down her spine. Something inside her whispered insistently, "Go back home, go to the store, find shelter somewhere." This inner voice sounded so clear, as if someone were standing next to her and speaking directly into her ear. She slowed her pace, trying to understand the source of this sudden panic. Had she forgotten something? No, she had the bag with the samples. Perhaps something was wrong with the order, but the meeting had gone perfectly. Amara glanced around, instinctively scanning for any possible threat. The street was filled with the usual bustle of this time of day. Hurrying passers-by, slowly passing cars, street vendors. Nothing suspicious. She tried to push away the unpleasant feeling, chalking it up to fatigue after the tense meeting and the excitement. Just nerves, she told herself, but the anxiety didn't subside. It only intensified, tightening her throat and forcing her to breathe faster. An inner voice insistently repeated, "Turn back, now! Go to that store around the corner. Hide!" Amara even took a hesitant step toward the nearest store, whose display window glittered just 20 meters away. She so desperately wanted to follow this instinctive impulse, to take refuge behind the glass door, among strangers and counters, to feel safe. She slowed almost to a halt, torn between her mind, which told her everything was fine, and her intuition, which screamed danger, but it was already too late. Suddenly, a black SUV stopped her. 2 men quickly got out. Before she could even comprehend what was happening, she was forced inside. The door slammed. Someone pulled a bag over her head. Her arms were twisted, and then the strangest, yet only logical thought occurred to her. Could one of the customers really have been so dissatisfied? Maybe that man last week who didn't like the sandalwood scent, but he just left and never called again. Or that woman who complained about the price? But everything seemed to have been sorted out. She thought about everyone she might accidentally disturb. Perhaps her new fragrance, Whisper of the Garden, had coincided with the development of a major perfume house, and they had decided to eliminate the competition. But that was absurd. She was just a small independent perfumer, working to order. Perhaps she had unwittingly witnessed something important? But she was always immersed in her thoughts, in a world of sense, rarely paying attention to what was happening around her. She mentally replayed every conversation, every encounter. Trying to find even the slightest hint of a threat, she recalled facial expressions, intonations, casually dropped phrases. But nothing, not a single clue, not a single hint as to what could have led to such a brutal kidnapping. In her world, a world of creativity and beauty, there was simply no room for such cruelty. Her universe consisted of scents and the emotions they evoked. She created perfumes to bring joy, to evoke their best memories, to help them feel more confident and happy. Her art was pure and harmless. She made people happier. She saw their faces change when they found their scent. She saw a young bride's eyes light up when she found the perfect wedding perfume. She saw an insecure young man's shoulders straighten when he found the scent that made him feel stronger. This was her calling, her gift to the world. She wished no ill will on anyone. Even when clients were dissatisfied, she patiently sought compromise. Even when competitors spread rumors about her work, she preferred not to engage in conflict, but simply to work better. Her philosophy was simple: to do good through her art. She didn't know these people had been watching her for days. They knew her schedule, where she lived, where she worked. They saw her smiling at passers-by, how carefully she selected oils at the store. They were convinced she posed no threat. She was simply a tool, a key to her brother. The car pulled away, taking her away from her familiar life. Amara had no idea that from that day on, her life would never be the same. Her dream of the store, her peace, her faith in goodness, all of it remained there, on the wet sidewalk, next to her fallen bag, from which jasmine oil slowly leaked, mixing with the rainwater. Amara sat in the car with her hands bound. Through the cloth bag over her head, she could only hear the sound of the engine, and then a thought struck her. The bag! Her suitcase with the scents remained on the asphalt. "Please," her voice trembled. "My bag. Come back for it. It's all I have." She waited for the blow, but it didn't come. Over the saloon. Then Hansel's calm voice rang out. "Come back!" The car turned around. The door opened, and someone tossed her precious bag into the trunk. Amara closed her eyes, unaware that her creative tools would soon become the tools of her salvation. Lee Hansel gave his orders briefly and clearly. "Take her to the warehouse, the old one, the one by the port. Lock her in, no contact with the outside world. Remove the blindfold only once she's inside, and warn her." His men nodded silently. They were professionals. When the car finally stopped, Amara was led out and up creaking wooden steps. The air smelled of damp, salt, and rusty metal. Only then was the bag removed from her head. She blinked, blinded by the dim light. She found herself in a large, empty room. A warehouse. High ceilings, dusty windows right at the ceiling, through which rays of the setting sun filtered. Dust hung in the air. In the corner stood a cot with a simple blanket. Next to it, a bottle of water and some food. The door was massive, made of metal. One of the men, the larger one, looked at her blankly. "Just sit quietly, no problem. If your brother returns the money, you'll leave alive and unharmed. If you start pulling tricks, you'll only make things worse for yourself. Understand?" Amara nodded silently, her trembling fingers clutching the handle of her rescued bag. The door slammed shut, the key turning in the lock with a loud final click. She was left alone. The silence was deafening. The only sounds were the distant whistle of a ship and the creaking of old beams. She spent the first few hours in a daze, sitting on the cot and staring into space. Fear paralyzed her, but then her gaze fell on her bag, on her tools, her world. And through the panic, a thought began to form in her head. The thought of salvation. She noticed it on the second day. In the evening, at roughly the same time, the door opened. 2 men came in. One remained at the entrance, while the other, the one who had spoken to her in the car, his name was Pak, took a photo of her on his phone. Silently. Then they left, just as silently. She realized it was proof to her brother that she was alive and well. Their visit lasted exactly as long as it took to take the photo. No more than 2 minutes. This was her chance. A narrow window of opportunity, but still a window of opportunity. They always arrived in the evening. This meant she had almost a full day between their visits to get ready, to work. She opened her bag. Inside were bottles of essential oils, alcohol, empty samplers, and pipettes. Her little laboratory. Only now she had to create not perfume for joy, but a weapon for survival. She started thinking about Hansel, about his character. Cold, controlled, strong. He was Korean, raised in a culture that valued restraint, order, and hierarchy, which meant he couldn't be wooed by a simple floral or sweet scent. He needed to be hit right on target, blown all the fuses. She began to mentally assemble an image of a woman who could captivate him, not soft and gentle, strong, mysterious. Someone who smelled not of comfort, but of challenge and mystery. The scent had to be a low blow, unexpected, irresistible. It had to bypass all barriers of his mind and strike straight at his instincts. She took out the vials. Her fingers, trembling at first, grew more confident. This was her element. She took dark, woody notes as a base. Sandalwood. Its deep, creamy, slightly sweet warmth. This was the foundation. The basis of strength and nobility. She added vetiver, the scent of dry earth, roots, smoke. A note of wildness, rebellion, something primordial. Then leather, an artificial, sharp, almost rough leather note, so that it would smell of strength, power, the masculine world in which he moved, but it was too obvious, too direct. He needed contrast, something that would break that mask, something that would get to what he was hiding deep inside. She added black pepper, a sharp, burning, almost painful note, to tickle the nostrils, to stir the blood, and at the very center of the composition, a tiny drop, just one, of the absolutely rare and expensive oil, asafoetida. This was her secret card, a plant with an incredibly persistent, animalic, almost lustful scent, which in microdoses produced a wild magnetic attraction. A trigger scent, and the final touch. To tie it all together, she added a note of incense, smoky, sacred, mystical, so that it smelled not just like a woman, but like a mystery, like rock. She worked for days, mixing, sniffing, adjusting. She barely ate or slept. Her world narrowed to this scent. She applied it to her wrist, her neck, sniffing, capturing the changes. It was powerful, hypnotic, dark and alluring at the same time. The kind that takes your breath away and makes you want to inhale it again and again. She hid all traces of her work. Empty bottles went to the bottom of her bag. The finished mixture went into a small sampler, which she tucked into her jeans pocket. The room was ventilated through cracks in the walls, and the smell disappeared by morning. She waited. She sat on the cot with the most indifferent expression when Park's men arrived. She even stopped flinching at the sound of the key in the lock. And then the day came. She knew that this evening wouldn't be just any people coming. Today, as she'd overheard from their brief conversation, Hansel himself was supposed to arrive. He wanted to personally make sure everything was under control before meeting his brother again. Her heart was pounding. She pulled out the hidden sample. A drop behind her ear, another on her collarbone, another, the tiniest, on the back of her hand. The scent was invisible, yet incredibly powerful. It surrounded her in a subtle yet lingering cloud. She sat and waited. The minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, the familiar scraping of a key. The door opened. Park entered first, as always. But behind him, stepping over the threshold, appeared a tall, trim figure in a perfectly fitting dark coat. Lee Hansel. His cold gaze slid over her, assessing her. He said something quietly to Park, who took out his phone to take a photo. Amara sat motionless, her eyes downcast, feigning fear. But her entire being was tense to the limit. Hansel stood, watching. The air in the room was still, and that same scent drifted through it. At first, just a strange note in the smell of dust and dampness, then stronger. Hansel wrinkled his nose slightly. His gaze, which had been wandering around the room, returned to Amara. He sniffed. His expression didn't change, but in his eyes, so habitually empty, a spark of something flickered. Surprise? Interest? He took a step closer. Park, having finished filming, looked at him, waiting for the order to leave. But Hansel didn't leave. He stood and looked at Amara. The scent was doing its job. Dark, woody, with that wild animalistic note of asafoetida and a smoky trail of incense. It was like a key to the secret lock of his soul. "What is that smell?" he finally asked. His voice was still even, but it lacked the icy detachment of before. Amara slowly looked up at him. She didn't answer. She simply looked, and let her scent speak for her, speak in a language he couldn't ignore. He moved even closer, only a few steps away. He inhaled deeply, analyzing, trying to understand. His mind, always so clearly in control of the situation, was failing for the first time. His defenses were melting under the onslaught of this inexplicable magnetism. He looked at her not as a hostage, but as an enigma, and in that moment, Amara realized her plan had worked. The first, most dangerous battle had been won. Now everything depended on where this scent would lead him. The scent she had created to drive him crazy, and to survive. The next day, Amara applied perfume again before the Mafia's arrival. As soon as Hansel and his men entered, they froze in the doorway. A strange scent filled the air. Hansel suddenly lost his menacing expression. He forgot why he'd come and simply looked at Amara. His gaze softened. Even his assistants had changed. They usually glared at her menacingly, but today they simply stood there, breathing in that scent. They quickly took a photo for Amara's brother and left. No one uttered a threatening word. No one tried to intimidate her. They simply left her alone, as if they'd forgotten she was a prisoner. Amara was left alone. Her plan was working. The spirits were doing their job. They were making these dangerous men calm down. Now she knew she had found a way to protect herself. Hansel finished his chores late that night. He stood in his bedroom, unable to sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the captive girl, to Amara. It irritated him. She was just a tool, but for some reason, he kept thinking about her face. He felt strange in the warehouse today. Usually, he came there to scare her, to show his power. But today, everything went wrong. As soon as he stepped inside, he noticed a faint scent. Not a strong one, but barely perceptible. Something warm and pleasant. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it had a strange effect on him. Suddenly, he realized he didn't want to be a tough boss. He wanted to relax with her, just stand in silence. This feeling was new and strange. Now, tonight, he admitted to himself honestly, he wanted to see her again. Not as a hostage, but as... He himself didn't know how. He tried to fight the thought. It was dangerous, stupid. But the desire to return to the warehouse was stronger than reason. Then he began to analyze what exactly had happened. And then it dawned on him. The smell. It's that strange, barely perceptible aroma. The girl did it very cleverly. She didn't use harsh perfume. She created something that worked on the subconscious. He remembered how he couldn't concentrate this evening, how he forgot why he came, how he just wanted to stand and breathe this air. Now he understood. She had created a scent that was addictive, that made him come back again and again. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. Usually this view calmed him. But today, nothing helped. The thought of the girl wouldn't go away. Her image was before my eyes, her modest pose, her head bowed, and that elusive scent that drove me crazy. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, that she might be manipulating him. But this realization didn't help. The desire to be with her again was too strong. It's just a scent, he tried to convince himself. But it didn't work. It wasn't just a scent. It was a weapon. Silent, unnoticeable, but highly effective. He wondered how she'd achieved this. The girl had proven much smarter than he'd imagined. She hadn't screamed or cried. She'd found a different way to fight. And it worked. He, Lee Hansol, who had kept everyone in fear, now found himself trapped. A trap created by essential oils and feminine cunning. Tomorrow he would go to the warehouse again. He knew it, not because he had to, but because he couldn't resist. He was drawn there like a magnet. And the scariest thing was that she probably knew it. She anticipated his reaction. She was waiting for his return. He lay down in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Her face was before his eyes. It was as if that same scent was lingering in his nose again. Sweet, warm, dangerous. For the first time in many years, he felt less like the master of the situation and more like a pawn in someone else's game. And that was what troubled him most. Hansel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling trapped in his own thoughts. A voice of reason echoed in his head. She's a hostage, a tool, nothing more. But somehow this simple truth no longer worked. He woke up feeling exhausted. At breakfast, he pushed his plate away. He couldn't swallow a single bite. He called his men to a meeting, but instead of listening to the reports, he stared at the pattern on the expensive Persian carpet. A stain on the fabric suddenly reminded him of the shape of her lips when she smiled yesterday. "Boss?" One of his subordinates called out to him cautiously. Hansel winced. "What? Did you listen to the report?" He stood up abruptly. "The meeting is over." The whole day passed in feverish anticipation. He tried to get things done, checking financial reports, signing documents, but the numbers blurred before his eyes. At one point, he realized he'd written her name, Amara, instead of her signature on an important contract. By evening, he couldn't take it anymore. He went to the kitchen and personally prepared dinner, choosing the freshest ingredients and making sure the chef prepared his favorite dishes. The chef looked at him in surprise. His boss never cared about such details. The bodyguard remained silent as he drove to the warehouse, but Hansel sensed his confusion. Usually, they brought the prisoners the simplest food, to keep them from starving. And here were exquisite dishes in a lacquered box. The warehouse smelled different, not just damp and dusty, but something else, something alive. She sat on a chair by the wall, drawing something on the dusty floor with her finger. Seeing him, she wasn't startled, but merely looked up. "I brought dinner," he said, aware of how stupid it sounded. She looked at the box, then at him. Slowly she rose and accepted the food. Their fingers touched, and he felt a strange warmth. "Thank you." Her voice was quiet but confident. She sat down and began to eat, slowly with dignity, as if at a dinner party. He watched her every movement, the way she carefully picked up rice with her chopsticks, the way she broke off a piece of fish. "Aren't you afraid that I'll poison the food?" He couldn't help but ask. She looked up at him. "If you wanted to kill me, you would have done it already." She was right, deadly right. When she finished, she carefully folded the box and handed it to him. "Thank you. This was the best food I've had in a long time." He picked up the box and noticed she'd placed something small and white inside. A flower, a simple wildflower that had probably sprouted here, in the cracks in the floor. "What is this?" he asked. Gratitude. She smiled again. The same enigmatic smile that drove him crazy. He walked out, clutching a fragile flower. He held it tightly as he walked home. The flower smelled. It smelled of hope, and something else he couldn't quite place. At home, he placed the flower in a glass of water. He sat across from her and stared at it until late into the night. His men reported that Amara's brother had contacted him, asking for more time. Normally, such impudence would have infuriated him, but now he simply nodded. Let him wait. He knew he was losing control of the situation, of himself. But the strangest thing was, he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt something real. Not fear, not anger, not a lust for power, but something else. Delicate and dangerous, like this fragile flower on his table. Tomorrow he would go to her again, and he would bring more than just food. He already knew he wanted to give her the book of poetry he had loved in his youth. Before he became who he was. It was madness. But perhaps this was precisely the kind of madness he had been missing all these years. The next day arrived. Hansel arrived at the warehouse earlier than usual. He stood in the doorway and watched Amara sitting in her chair, wrapped in a thin blanket. The room was cool and damp. "Aren't you cold here?" he asked, and his own voice sounded unfamiliar to him, without its usual commanding intonation. Amara flinched in surprise and looked up at him. "I'm used to it," she replied simply. But that wasn't enough for him. It was as if someone inside him had flipped a switch. That same evening, a small heater appeared in the warehouse. A day later, a warm blanket and pillows. His men silently carried out his orders, but their eyes showed confusion. His visits became more frequent. He found the most ridiculous excuses. "We need to check the ventilation," he'd say, stepping inside and pretending to inspect the dusty air vents. "There should have been some old documents here," he'd declare another time, glancing through some empty cardboard boxes in the corner. He himself didn't understand why this was happening. He, a man accustomed to precise formulations and clear goals, couldn't explain this craving to himself. He only knew that in her presence, the eternal chill within him thawed a little. The silence with her was comfortable, not oppressive, and that damnable aroma that hung around her became more than just a scent for him, but oxygen. He caught himself entering a room and taking a deep breath first, to fully experience it. He was bewitched, enchanted. And all this, with the help of a few drops of perfume, created by her hands. On one of these visits, looking at how she carefully combed her hair with her fingers, using the reflection in the dark window, he caught himself thinking a seditious thought. Such a girl should not sit here. The thought was as simple and clear as a bell. She shouldn't be sitting on a warehouse chair, wrapped in someone else's blanket. She should be sitting in the best restaurant in town, smiling under the chandeliers, her hair smelling not of dust, but of expensive perfume. His perfume. The idea took hold of him with unexpected force. She was no longer a hostage. She had become a woman he, for some incredible reason, wanted to see happy. Meanwhile, Amara was already on her 7th day of captivity. The initial plan was simple and clear: survive and escape. Use her only weapon, perfume, to make this mafioso fall in love with her, weaken his will, and escape when he lets his guard down. But something went wrong. At first, she simply watched him, studying her target. He was athletic, with a body that spoke of strength and discipline. He was commanding. Every word, every gesture betrayed a man accustomed to command. And he was devilishly handsome in his reserved, almost cruel grace. Black hair, dark, piercing eyes, sharp cheekbones. He exuded that genuine, primal masculine strength that had always attracted her in movies and books, but which she had never encountered in real life, among polite colleagues and clients. She found herself anticipating his arrival. Her heart would beat a little faster when she heard his footsteps outside the door. She would begin to worry about her appearance and secretly try to tidy herself up. That day, when he asked her if she was cold, something in her trembled. It wasn't just a strategy. Behind that care, clumsy and awkward, shone through genuine concern for her. Not for the hostage, but for her as a woman. And so, sitting alone that evening, under the warm blanket he'd brought, Amara allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been subconsciously realizing for days. He was exactly the type of man she'd always liked. Strong, dangerous, capable of action. And this man seemed seriously attracted to her. She caught herself wondering, what if she changed the plan's direction? Escape was risky. Her brother, if he was even planning to return the money, was clearly in no hurry. And here he was, already caught in her net, dependent on her presence, on her scent. If he's already so focused on me, she mused, maybe I should reciprocate his feelings. Not feigned ones, but genuine ones? The thought was both terrifying and exciting. He was a criminal, a kidnapper, but he was also someone who, with each passing day, blurred the lines between jailer and admirer. Soon, she sensed, he would begin to act more decisively. His gazes grew more direct, his casual touches, when he handed her food or things, more lingering. They will inevitably become closer. And if she allows this to happen, if she doesn't resist, but rather cooperates, then everything could change. His status as a hostage could shift to something else, to someone he wants to woo, someone he wants to protect, and perhaps, ultimately, let her go, not as a prisoner, but as the woman he's chosen, and who, perhaps, will choose him. It was a dangerous, high-stakes game, far more dangerous than the original escape plan. Not only her freedom was at stake here, but also her heart. But, looking at the locked door, beyond which lay a world full of grayness and loneliness, Amara realized she was ready to take the risk. Perhaps her captivity would be the beginning of something new, and the key to this new thing wasn't escape, but him, Lee Hansel, and she was ready to give him that key. Hansel walked into his bedroom and slammed the door. He hadn't slept a wink last night. The same thought kept running through his head. Stop beating around the bush. He caught himself behaving like a boy, not a mafia boss. Every visit to the warehouse, every excuse he made, it was all pathetic. He was tired of pretending, but there were still questions that nagged at him. Was she seeing someone? How could she feel about him after he'd literally torn her from her normal life? The thought of possible rejection filled him with a strange feeling. Not fear, but something akin to rage. He wasn't used to being rejected. I'll take a chance, he finally decided. I'll offer her a deal. But even he needed time to gather his courage. The thought made him chuckle. He, Lee Hansel, was afraid to propose to a woman. The next 2 days were filled with business. Problems arose with one of the suppliers, and he had to deal with them harshly. Pack, his right-hand man, looked at him with surprise. Usually the boss was cold and calculating, but now there was a certain haste, almost nervousness to his actions. The situation was escalating, and the strangest thing was, they both enjoyed it. Hansel caught himself thinking about her even during serious arguments. Her image wouldn't leave his head. On the 3rd day, he couldn't take it anymore. Dropping everything, he went to the warehouse. Not in the evening as usual, but in the middle of the day. When he opened the door, Amara was sitting in her place, writing something on a scrap of paper. She wasn't alarmed when she saw him, but simply put the paper away and looked up at him. I can let you go, he said without preamble. And forgive your brother's debt. She froze, waiting for him to continue. Her eyes held both hope and caution. In exchange, you'll go on 1 date with me, he breathed. Just 1. After that, you're free. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Amara stood slowly, her fingers nervously fiddling with the hem of her sweater. Just a date? She asked quietly. Just a date, he nodded. Dinner at a restaurant, no strings attached. She looked at him, trying to read his hidden motives. What if I refuse? Then everything will remain as it is, he shrugged, pretending not to care. But from the tension in his back, she could tell he cared. Through Amara's mind, this was her chance for freedom. But what was behind this offer? She'd studied it enough to know that Lee Hansel didn't do anything without reason. Okay, she finally said. I agree. The corners of his lips twitched into a barely noticeable smile. This evening, I'll pick you up. He turned and walked out, leaving her with mixed feelings. On the one hand, joy at the prospect of freedom. On the other, anxiety. And something else. Curiosity. What would happen on this date? Would she really be able to leave afterward? Meanwhile, Hansel left the warehouse with a strange feeling. For the first time in years, he felt something akin to excitement. Not before meeting enemies, not before an important deal, but before a date with a woman. He pulled out his phone and made a few calls. He booked the best restaurant in town. He scared away all the other customers. He ordered the freshest ingredients to be delivered there. His men followed orders, but their voices were tinged with confusion. The boss was acting out of character. Amara remained in the warehouse, trying to comprehend what was happening. Her plan had worked, but not quite as she expected. She'd imagined an escape, not a date. Now everything depended on one evening. Could she seize this opportunity? And what would happen if she truly fell in love with this dangerous, mysterious man? She went to her hiding place and pulled out a small bottle of perfume. The same one that had driven him crazy. "I'll have to create something special," she whispered. "Something he'll remember forever." The thought that this date might not be the end, but the beginning of something more, made her heart beat faster. Perhaps fate had something more in store for them than just the relationship of hostage and captor. Amara froze at his offer. It was exactly what she'd hoped for, but such a direct and swift turn of events was unexpected. When Hansel proposed a deal, a date in exchange for freedom and forgiveness of her brother's debt, she agreed almost without hesitation. The spark had already flown between them, and there was no point in delaying it. Their agreement was simple. Her brother would no longer owe her anything, and she would be free after one date. But instead of releasing her immediately, Hansel ordered a room in his mansion for her. As the car pulled up to a huge house in an upscale neighborhood of Seoul, Amara held her breath. She'd expected something ostentatious, but before her was a model of exquisite architecture. A minimalist 3-story mansion with panoramic windows and a perfect garden. Her room was on the second floor. It wasn't a temporary apartment, but a spacious space with its own bathroom and balcony. Everything was done in soothing tones, but it felt like it hadn't been used in a while. The first 2 days passed in a strange, unrealistic atmosphere. Amara paced the room, touching surfaces with her hands, then went out onto the balcony and gazed at the manicured garden. She couldn't believe her plan had worked so brilliantly. She'd expected an escape, but instead, she'd gotten something more. Interesting situations began immediately. Amara's hands trembling, she said softly, "Relax, dear. The master has never brought anyone here before. You're the first." These words made Amara pause. On the second morning, a funny incident occurred. Amara, accustomed to independence, tried to go down to the kitchen and make herself some tea. Along the way, she got lost in the maze of corridors and accidentally ended up in the office where Hansel was talking on the phone. Seeing her, he didn't get angry, but merely raised an eyebrow and gestured in the direction she should go. But the most memorable moment happened on the third day. In the morning, 2 maids entered her room with a multitude of expensive bags. "The master asked you to choose something for the evening," one of them explained. When Amara peered into the bags, she gasped. They contained elegant dresses, high heels, and finely crafted jewelry. Everything had been selected with exquisite taste, but most importantly, every item fit perfectly. This thoughtful gesture touched her more than the cost of the gifts. That evening, as she was choosing between a black dress and a ripe cherry-colored one, there was a knock on the door. Hansel himself stood there. "It's 9 o'clock. Be ready," he said curtly. His gaze slid over the outfits laid out on the bed. "Wear what you like, but—" He paused, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "This might go with the black dress." The box contained a pair of elegant earrings with deep blue stones. Amara noticed that their color perfectly matched the shade of her favorite patchouli oil. "Thank you," she managed to say. "But how did you know my size?" He chuckled. "It was enough to look at the tags on your clothes in that bag you were so desperately saving." This answer made her realize that he had been watching her much more closely than she had imagined. After he left, Amara stood in front of the mirror for another hour, trying on outfits. She chose a black dress, elegant, backless, but not provocative. The earrings were truly perfect. Looking at her reflection, she couldn't believe that the same girl who had been shaking with fear in the warehouse a week ago was now preparing for a date with a formidable mafia boss. And the most amazing thing was, she liked it. She liked the attention. She liked the care. She liked this strange, dangerous romance. She remembered her brother's words, always saying, "There's no room for fairy tales in our lives." But what was happening now felt like the most incredible fairy tale. Only instead of a prince, there was a mafia boss. Instead of a castle, there was a mansion. And instead of an evil queen, there was her own fear. But the fear gradually receded, giving way to a new, unfamiliar feeling: hope. Hope that perhaps this strange story could have a happy ending. When the clock struck 9:15, Amara took one last look in the mirror. "You did it," she whispered to her reflection. "Now we'll see what happens next." Hansel was already waiting downstairs. Their gazes met on the stairs, and she saw something new in his eyes. Not the coldness of a calculating mafioso, but the warm admiration of a man seeing a beautiful woman. And in that moment, Amara realized the game was just beginning, and the stakes had become even higher. A month passed. The horror Amara had experienced on the day of her abduction now seemed like a bad dream. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night, and for the first few seconds, she couldn't believe she was lying in a soft bed in a room overlooking a manicured garden, and not on a folding chair in a dusty warehouse. She was happy. The irony was incredible. What seemed like the end of her life had become the beginning of something real. She had forgotten all about escaping. Why? Here, next to Hansel, she felt like never before, desired, protected, meaningful. He had become the man with whom she blossomed. The first week of their new life together had begun. Amara greeted the morning after that very same date with a slight feeling of unease. What now? All the formalities had been observed, her brother's debt was forgiven, and she was free. Going down to the dining room, she discovered that Hansel had already left on business. The housekeeper, Mrs. Kim, silently handed her a thin envelope. Inside was a credit card in her name and a note with just 2 words written in his firm handwriting: "Stay, H." It wasn't an offer or a request, but a statement of fact full of his characteristic confidence. And this confidence strangely communicated itself to her, calming her worries. That evening, Hansel returned late. He entered the house, and Amara, hearing his footsteps, came out to join him in the living room. He looked exhausted, his shoulders tense, and his eyes had the familiar wall he used to hide his weariness. Seeing her, he froze for a moment. Then, without a word, simply walked up to her and hugged her. It wasn't passionate, but rather a tired, almost desperate gesture. Amara realized that behind his iron mask lurked a man desperately in need of simple human support. She didn't ask questions, didn't try to console him with words, but simply let him stand there, holding her, until his breathing became even and the muscles in his back relaxed. They barely spoke that evening, but that silence became their first truly intimate moment. The second week was underway. Amara had begun to settle in, not as a guest, but as a hostess. Her creative nature was looking for an outlet. She noticed that Hansel often worked in his study at home until late at night, and the air there became stuffy and heavy. She asked Ms. Kim to buy her certain essential oils: cedar for confidence, bergamot for mental clarity, and a hint of mint for energy. In her room, she created a complex composition and discreetly sprayed it in his study that evening while he was eating dinner. Nino listened silently, his face expressionless. This imperturbability made April even more nervous. Creative nature was looking for an outlet that Hansel often worked late at night and heavy. She asked for certain essential oils: bergamot for mental clarity, his face expressionless, even more nervous. Heavy. She asked. From then on, cooking together on weekends became their favorite tradition. The third week began, and their intimacy reached a new level. One night, Amara woke to the sound of his muffled scream. Hansel was thrashing in bed, his body tense to the limit, his face contorted in terror. He was experiencing a nightmare. Amara didn't wake him, knowing it could be dangerous. Instead, she embraced him more easily and began to speak softly. She talked about nothing: the sound of the rain outside, the smell of the air after a storm, the shape of the moon she saw from the balcony. Her voice was even and calm, and her hands gently stroked his hair. Gradually, he calmed down. His breathing evened out, and he fell into a deep sleep. In the morning, he said nothing about the incident, but his gaze as he looked at her at breakfast became even more vulnerable and open. She realized that he too had demons, and he allowed her to see them, confiding in her his vulnerability. She was afraid to say the next thing, but she felt she had to. She saw from the balcony. Calm, and her hands gently. Gradually, he calmed down, evened out, and he fell. Morning, he said nothing. She saw from the balcony. Calm, and her hands gently. Gradually, he calmed down, evened out, and he fell. Morning, he said nothing. I can't thank you enough. I was fired yesterday. I have no money, no work. Her voice wavered. I don't want to be indebted to anyone, especially now when I have nothing to pay with. Enough. I was fired yesterday. No money, no work. I don't want to be indebted now when I have nothing to pay with. Their story, which began with kidnapping and blackmail, evolved into a strong, strange, but true union of two people who found in each other what they had been missing. Everything worked out, and they were content, living each new day full of small discoveries and a quiet, deep happiness. Amara was finishing packaging her new batch of perfume when Hansel entered the lab. Over the past few weeks, she had completely outfitted the spacious space on the second floor of his mansion. Glass shelves brimmed with bottles of essential oils, and a precision scale and set of pipettes sat on the marble table. It was everything she could have dreamed of in her old studio apartment. She carefully placed 6 identical bottles of golden liquid into a wooden crate. It was a commission for a new boutique in Apgujeong. Just a month ago, she could only dream of such clients, but now her creations were sold in Seoul's most prestigious stores. Hansel watched her work silently. He'd learned to treasure these moments of silence when she was completely absorbed in her work. In recent weeks, he'd seen a noticeable change. His subordinates noted that their boss had become less reliant on force, preferring to negotiate. Even Park, his right-hand man, was surprised by this transformation. Their peaceful occupancy was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up to the mansion. Hansel walked to the window and saw a modest sedan pull up at the gate. Kang Do-hyun stepped out. His appearance spoke volumes, his rumpled suit, unsteady gait, and nervous movements. A few minutes later, the guard escorted the guest into the office. Do-hyun entered, and his eyes immediately began darting around the room, stopping first at Hansel, then at Amar. He began speaking rapidly, barely pausing for breath, offering to return all the money with interest, begging for his sister's release. Hansel listened to him without interrupting. When Do-hyun finished his emotional speech, Hansel calmly explained that the debt was forgiven and there were no claims, but Do-hyun couldn't believe it. He looked at Amara with such a look of guilt and despair that she couldn't bear it and approached him. Amara spoke softly but confidently. She told her brother about her new life, the lab, the clients, and how Hansel had changed. Do-hyun listened, and gradually his panic began to give way to bewilderment, and then to understanding. He saw that his sister spoke sincerely, that there was not a trace of fear or coercion in her eyes. When Amara finished, silence fell over the room. Do-hyun slowly surveyed the office, the expensive furniture, the paintings on the walls, the perfect order everywhere. His gaze settled on his sister, her posture, her gaze, held a confidence he'd never seen before. Amara stepped forward and placed her hand on her brother's shoulder. She asked him to change his life, to use his abilities for honest business, to stop constantly looking over his shoulder and being afraid. Her words sounded not like a reproach, but like the concern of an older sister who believes in him. Do-hyun nodded silently. He looked at Amara again, and a new expression appeared in his eyes: respect. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. The sound of the door closing behind him sounded like a period in their past. Amara walked to the window and watched her brother's car disappear into the evening lights of Seoul. She reflected on the strange twists of fate. Just a few weeks ago, she had been a prisoner in a dusty warehouse, and now she stood here, in a luxurious mansion, with every opportunity to realize her wildest creative visions. Hansel came over and stood next to her. He said nothing, but his silent presence spoke louder than words. Over the past few weeks, they'd learned to understand each other without unnecessary explanations. Amara turned and looked at her laboratory. It had everything she needed for work, from rare essential oils to state-of-the-art equipment. But most importantly, it gave her the freedom to create without worrying about money or the future. Dreamed of, and she was ready to make the most of them. Hansel watched her silently. Satisfaction was evident in his eyes. He had found not just a woman, but an equal partner, someone who understood him and accepted him for who he was. Their relationship was built not on fear or dependence, but on mutual respect and shared interests. Amara walked to the table and closed the lid of the wooden box containing the finished perfume. Tomorrow, a courier would pick it up, and 6 more women would be able to enjoy her creation. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction in her work, something she had been deprived of during all the previous years of struggle and hardship. Her life took on new meaning and direction. And although the path here had been strange and indirect, she had no doubt about her choice. Do-hyun walked out of the mansion and got into his car. He didn't start the engine right away, but simply sat there, staring straight ahead. His hands were shaking slightly. He thought about what he had just seen. Amara was calm and confident. She didn't look scared or unhappy. This wasn't what he expected to see. He remembered her voice on the phone when she'd just been kidnapped, how she'd trembled. And now she looked like she was in control. He felt ashamed, deeply ashamed. It was because of him that she found herself in this situation, because of his greed and stupidity. He wanted easy money, and in the end, he let down the only person close to him. He imagined what could have happened if Hansol had turned out to be a different person, more cruel. If Amara hadn't found the strength to fight, it could have ended much worse. He remembered their childhood, how he'd protected her at school, how he'd promised to always take care of her, but it had turned out the other way around. He'd brought her problems. Do-hyun started the car and drove slowly. The city flashed past the window, but he barely noticed it. His thoughts were preoccupied with one thing. Amara said everything was fine, that she was happy, that she had everything she needed to work. But he knew what she had been through. Weeks in captivity, fear, uncertainty. He realized he was lucky, very lucky. Lucky that Amara had been strong. Lucky that Hansel had forgiven him. Lucky that there had been no bloodshed. At the traffic light, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. A tired face, bags under his eyes. He couldn't live like this anymore. He made a decision, firm and final. All these scams, deceptions, risks, all of it must end. Today, now. He couldn't afford to put his loved ones at risk any longer. One day, his luck would be unsatisfactory. And he wouldn't be the only one paying the price. He remembered Amara's words. She'd asked him to start an honest business, to use his head for something good. Maybe she's right. He does have talent. He knows how to count money, spot opportunities, negotiate. He just used it in the wrong places. He came home, to his empty apartment. Everything here was expensive, but soulless, just like his life in recent years. He sat down at the table and took out a notepad. He began jotting down ideas. What could he do? What was he good at? What honest business could he start? Maybe open a small restaurant? He's always had a knack for food. Or go into retail? But legally, with genuine goods. His thoughts flowed slowly. It was difficult. It would have been much easier to come up with another scam, but he forced himself to think differently. He knew it would be difficult. He'd have to start small. He might even have to live frugally for a while. But it would be worth it. The main thing is that he won't wake up at night at every rustle. He won't be afraid that they'll come for him. He won't worry that others will get hurt because of him. He looked at the photograph of him and Amara as children. She was smiling. He wanted to see her like that again, happy and calm. And for that, he had to change. Do-hyun put away his notebook and began packing. Anything that reminded him of his old life had to go. The expensive watch he'd bought with his first ill-gotten gains, the suits he'd worn to shady meetings, even the phone he'd used for his business dealings. He put everything in a box and put it by the door. Tomorrow, he would get rid of it. Start a new life. A clean slate. It was scary. The unknown is always scary. But the fear for my loved ones was stronger. He went to bed, but couldn't fall asleep for a long time. Thoughts swirled in his head. Past mistakes, plans for the future, the promise he'd made to himself. He woke up this morning with a firm decision. Today was the first day of his new life. No deception, no risk, no fear. He left the house, leaving the box of things in the dumpster. He walked down the street and felt different. As if he'd dropped a heavy burden. There was much work ahead, many difficulties, but he was ready for them. For the first time in many years, he moved forward without looking over his shoulder. He walked into the cafe, sat down at a table, and pulled out his notebook again. He began to think through his first step. Small, but honest. He knew Amara would be proud of him, and that gave him strength. 6 months after that conversation at Hansel's mansion, everyone's lives had changed markedly. One sunny autumn day, they met by chance at a new restaurant in central Seoul. He paused, letting her take his words in. Many years, he moved forward without looking over his shoulder. He walked into the cafe, sat down at a table, and pulled out his notebook again. He began to think through his first step. Small, but honest. Into the cafe, sat down, pulled out his notebook again. He began to think through his first step. For everything that happened, for my stupid actions, Amara placed her hand on his. It's all in the past now. The main thing is that everything ended well. Hansel nodded. You corrected your mistakes. That means a lot. They talked for about another hour. Do-hyun talked about his plans to expand his business. Amara shared her excitement about the upcoming boutique opening. Even Hansel, usually reserved, talked about his new business ventures, both legal and successful. When it was time to leave, Do-hyun stood up and apologized again. I realized that the most important thing in life isn't money, but peace of mind and loved ones, he said. Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right. Amara hugged her brother. I always believed in you, Hansel shook his hand. If you need help with your business, just ask. They left the restaurant together. The autumn sun illuminated the city streets. Each went their separate ways, but now there was no hostility or mistrust between them. Amara and Hansel went to their mansion. Do-hyun went to his warehouse to check on new supplies. Everyone had their own worries and plans, but now they knew they could count on each other. Their story, which began with betrayal and kidnapping, ended in peace and understanding. Sometimes the darkest paths truly do lead to light. The key is to have the courage to admit your mistakes and start anew.